don't know is, yeah, there we go.
Meeting
It's
is
being
being
recorded.
recorded. Good. Okay. Because I might get a copy of the slide of the bloody hair looks dreadful as usual. I'll get a copy of the MP4 and put it up on my website as well.
Mhm.
All
Hey,
right, I guess,
Dave. Good to see you.
yeah, Steve, thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce you very quickly here, and you can add any items to what I'm about to say. But thanks to Steve Keen for joining us today at our meeting of the Economics Special Interest Group of the System Dynamics Society. I've known Steve around 25 years. And when we first met years ago, and I think it was Kansas City, he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I build dynamic models of economic systems using continuous time." And he says, "So do I."
It's
So
such a frustration. Yeah.
yeah, so I kind of became the American Steve Keen, and he kind of became the Australian Mike Radzicki or whatever. So, but at any rate, Steve has written a whole bunch of stuff, and he is a big online presence. The media loves him because he's very provocative and interesting, and doesn't just give the same old story to things. He's probably most widely known for his book, Debunking Economics, and it's a really great read for anyone who's interested in a critique of sort of the standard paradigm in the economics profession that everyone is taught. Whether they should be or not is a different matter. And more recently, his book is What Money and Macroeconomics First Principles for Elon Musk and Other Engineers. So with that, Steve, you can add to that if you want to emphasize something else, and or just go right into your presentation.
I think I'll go right in, mate. Just to mention, I'm now giving online courses as well. So a lot of the material here comes from the online course that I give, but it's probably the most mathematical lecture that I give in that course. So let's see. So I start from here. Okay. So can you see my screen? I hope.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay. I was actually, I don't think I've got any sound here, but just in case I do, and just get rid of these controls, get them out of the way. Okay, well, what I'm going to show today is that it's possible to derive macroeconomics from strictly true macroeconomic definitions. And this relates to the obsession that neoclassicals have had for the last 50 years, really, of trying to work out an uncontestable foundation for macro. Now, they did that with their dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, of course, all based on neoclassical micro, profit maximizing firms, utility maximizing consumers. Of course, not only did these models fail to see the financial crisis coming, they predicted that 2008 was going to be a great year. Yeah? So completely useless. But despite that failure, the neoclassicals still think it's the only way you can actually build those models. And this is Olivier Blanchard, as one of the leading members of the DSGE. Let's call it a cult. Back when he was chief of the IMF from that period of time, of course, that overlaps with the financial crisis. And then in the aftermath, he actually wrote a paper 1 year after the crisis began with the title of "The State of Macro is Good," would you believe? 1 year after the collapse of the BNP that set off the global financial crisis. He took a while to wake up, but he still thinks we've got to use micro. And see how convincing his argument is. This is typical neoclassical logic. Where else can you start from but micro? Has to be micro. And he rejects ad hoc equations, which of course we do as well. But that's where they began from. So they believe it must be derived from micro. But what I can show in these models, you don't need it. Micro is a waste of time. And not only is it a waste of time, it's completely wrong anyway as a description of the micro economy, let alone the macro economy. So you can start from simple definitions, and there's no ideology here, which is another curse of economics, the extent to which ideological views dominate what people do. You start from definitions that if you dispute them, you belong in a padded cell. Mind you, probably 95% of the economics profession does belong in a padded cell, but that's another story. And what you get is, so by taking these definitions, you actually get the fundamental models of post-Keynesian economics. Again, working in continuous time, not discrete time nonsense, as Mike and I are both enemies of that approach. But rather than finding the economy tends to equilibrium, you find that the equilibrium is neutral, the first equilibrium. We won't get there. They assume money and banking are irrelevant. In these models, private debt is absolutely critical, and they treat the government as something that makes the economy behave less well. What these models show is that the government prevents a debt deflation. Which is a rather nasty experience for a capitalist economy. It's had on several occasions. So you can work just from the employment rate, the wages share of GDP, the private debt ratio, and the ratio of the government deficit to GDP. And the models which emerge are firstly Goodwin's growth cycle with the two definitions. Secondly, Minsky's high financial instability hypothesis with 3, and effectively a complex systems version of MMT with the 4 definitions. And the basic way, it's ridiculously simple. I've been driving these models for decades, working originally from strict differential equations. But working with my good mate Matteo Scriselli, he pointed out that mathematicians just use this hat notation. And then what you've got is basically log differentiation. That means you can replace multiplication of 2 rates of change with adding the 2 together, ratios with a subtraction, and it actually makes it extremely easy to turn those definitions into a dynamic model, because so much of macro does involve ratios. The employment rate, the wages share of GDP, which gives you income distribution effectively, the private debt ratio and the government ratio. Take those together and you get a coherent approach to macroeconomics, which of course is completely different to what the neoclassicals do. So the employment rate is simple. It's just I use the Greek letter lambda for that for obvious reasons, the ratio of the number of people with a job to the population. And by the hat notation, you can then say that the rate of change of the ratio is the rate of change of labour minus the rate of change of population. And that then gives you another strictly true dynamic statement. The employment rate will rise if employment grows faster than population. It's still not a model, it's a definition, but in dynamic terms. Similarly with the wages share of GDP, you get the wages share of GDP will rise if wages grow faster than GDP. Now they're still true. There's not a model there. So you have to make some assumptions to link together the various system states. And I make these following simplifying assumptions, which are standard in post-Keynesian economics. So an output to labour ratio, and you assume that grows at a constant rate. That's effectively your technical change. We could make it a dependent system variable in a more sophisticated model, but this is foundational models. A capital output ratio, now neoclassicals will object to that because they think they've got fancy stuff by having variable ratios in the Cobb-Douglas production function. That is a total farce, and I'm happy to have a good chat about that later on a separate, if somebody wants to discuss why the Cobb-Douglas is nonsense, even from Cobb-Douglas's original work back in 1928. Assume constant population growth, a uniform wage, and a linear relationship, a linear Phillips curve fundamentally. So having done that, you start simply from the hat notation. So lambda hat ends up being L hat minus N hat. You replace N hat with delta N. You've already got that definition inside there. And you can replace L hat with the ratio of output to the output to labour ratio, simple algebra. So now I've got that expression. Then, of course, that means I can do one more subtraction. So I've now got a rate of change of output minus the rate of change of the output to labour ratio. We already know what that is, so I can substitute that inside. So what I'm left with at the moment is the rate of growth. Okay, well, that's how do we define that? Well, with the assumption that there's a constant, not a fixed, but a relatively constant ratio between output and capital, then you get output is going to be equal to capital divided by the capital output ratio. And then when you do your same log differentiation, because the capital output ratio is a constant, that becomes 0. So your rate of change of output is the rate of change of capital. And then that is basically investment minus depreciation. So I can now bring in the rate of change of the capital stock. And you can depreciation is a constant fraction of capital. That's, again, a fairly common statistical finding. Now, what about the only thing we're left now with is what's gross investment? And what Goodwin did for his first model was assume that capitalists invest all their profits. In other words, this is effectively the best of all capitalist worlds. The capitalists are doing what you want them to do, which is building factories. They're not buying yachts in this particular case or speculating on on share values. So now bring in the rate of change of capital, that's profits, which is output minus wages in this two-class system, minus depreciation. And now I can use that as my expression for the rate of change of output. And that comes to be output minus wages share divided by capital minus the rate of depreciation. So just to go from that, if I divide through by K to get back to K hat, I've now got K hat is output minus wages divided by capital. And then I can replace K with Y. Again, this is all very simple algebra. So what I end up with that is I've now got output minus wages divided by wages multiplied by the capital output ratio, divide through by Y, and I now have wages divided by output, which is one of my system states, the wages share of GDP. So I've now got the rate of change of the employment rate is 1 minus the wages share divided by the capital output ratio minus depreciation, technical change, and rate of growth of population. So this is now the first stage of the model. And this is, I remember having a chat with Michael Kumhoff as one of the few neoclassicals who understands money. And he's talking about some modification of his model and said, oh, it'd take him weeks or months to write it up. All the algebra necessary for doing a DSGE model. It's minutes in this sort of approach, and it's probably even faster with the system dynamics. So now I want to bring in the rate of change of the wages share, and I replace the wages share with the wage rate multiplied by labour. I replace labour with the with output divided by the output to labour ratio, and then pretty rapidly I'll get two terms that cancel. So very quickly, I've got the rate of change of wages share is equal to the rate of change of wages minus the rate of change of the output to labour ratio. And then expand this out, and I've now got the foundational model for macro, which are these two equations. And that's just verbally stating what they show. And that is Goodwin's, put it in differential equation form, that is Goodwin's growth cycle. Okay. So ridiculously quickly, this is like a magician with a hat. I've pulled out one of the fundamental models of post-Keynesian economics from strictly true economic definitions. And to put it all together, I need a set of parameters as well, of course. So those are the equations, and those are my parameters, my system states and my parameters, and then give some values to them. So I give initial values for the employment rate and the parameters, and those are all reasonable, not empirically derived, but that sort of level, but you can actually do better empirical fitting, which Grasselli and Costolima have done. Put that all together. This is what it looks like in equations, and this is what it looks like in my Ravel software, which I'll be pushing fairly heavily in this. As most of you probably know, I've designed a new system dynamics programming called Ravel, which was originally called Minsky. It's now called Ravel. Now, if I run the simulation, just to do it very rapidly, this is a recording, obviously. But one of the advantages of Ravel is it's built to actually show your simulations live rather than doing your model and then seeing the results in a static sense. I know it's now possible. I believe it's possible with Stella and Venn seem to do the same thing, but that's native in Ravel. Now, so that's Richard Goodwin's model. And he derived it the hard way. And there was a great piece of inspiration that he did it. What I love about this is an indisputable way of deriving a model that neoclassicals have no idea about. Okay? The only thing they can have a contention about is the constant output to capital ratio. And they think because they've got variable ratios in Cobb-Douglas, that's cooler. Yeah. But when you look at the role of energy in production, which is another research approach of mine, first of all, the Cobb-Douglas is a farce when you compare it to even its own grounds, by the way. If you go back to the 1928 paper that Cobb and Douglas wrote together, they claim that they got a correlation coefficient for the raw data of 0.97 and for the data in terms of change of variables of 0.94. In fact, they made a stupid choice of how to remove the trend, didn't remove the trend at all. And if you do the standard log differentiation approaches to get changes in data these days, you find the correlation coefficient that they get from their model is not 0.94, but minus 0.15. Minus 0.15. They're completely wrong model. But the main thing is when you include energy, the reason you get a constant ratio there is effectively that's stating the rate at which machinery turns energy into useful work. It's actually got a thermodynamical basis. So we have good foundations. The neoclassicals do not. This is right and consistent, and it's what I think we should teach students as an initial set of levels. In the very first lecture, if they can handle a bit of mathematics, you could get them deeply into post-Keynesian approaches to economics rather than neoclassical. So this actual model, which Goodwin devised back in 1967, was something which appeared out of the blue in Volume 1 of Capital. And in most of Capital, Volume 1, Marx deliberately kept the wage constant in his mind to explain where he saw surplus value coming from. But this set of phrases in the middle of chapter 20, or beginning of chapter 25, talks about a cycle. So he said the rate of accumulation lessens, rate of slowing down rate of investment. So there's less disproportion between capital and labour. The mechanism of the process removes the very obstacles it temporarily creates. The price of labour falls again to a level corresponding with the needs of capital, whether that be below, the same as, or above the previous level. So he's allowing for variability in both wages and the wages share of GDP. And then this punchline, which is quite remarkable in the context of Capital Volume 1. To put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent variable. The rate of wages, the dependent variable. And this is what Marx spent his dotage trying to put into mathematical form. He never managed to do it. He spent too much discussing the philosophy of infinitesimals in his attempts at mathematics. But he was on the way to the first system dynamics model. And this is 50 years before Locke de Volterra came along. So now that I've derived this model, I'll build the same model using system dynamics. And this is, of course, the approach we all prefer. And what you find, again, going back to Marx, is that forget about all the complex behavioral stuff the neoclassicals waffle on about to try to make their models work. Marx got it right. The structure actually dominates. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. Not under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted by the past. There's a bit more flowery language after that, but that's basically a structural view of what causes cyclical behaviour in a capitalist economy, not one dominated by hypotheses about individual behaviour. So you get the results that I've shown here because in a sense you're doing exactly what system dynamics does, looking for a causal relation between one factor and another. So that's the model done using the definition approach that I've just been through. This is the same model in a flowchart form as system dynamics in Ravel. And again, I think it is an advantage, certainly when you're trying to explain this to people who aren't mathematically inclined, to actually see the model running when you're explaining what the overall logic is. That's a basic causal loop diagram, and it generates exactly the same outcomes as the derivation I did by definitions in the first place. Now, to take the next one of the simplifying assumptions that Goodwin made was that all profits are invested. Well, the obvious generalization of that is capitalists invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump. So you need to have a behavioral relation that will give you that. Very simple. I'm just going to use a linear investment curve in the same sense that I had a Phillips curve beforehand. And then say that when they want to pay for that extra investment, they have to borrow money. And that then is where the rate of change of debt comes from. And amazingly, Fama and French, who were two of the scourges of neoclassical thought for pumping out that nonsense overall, they did a very nice empirical work using the CompuStat database in the States and found that debt was the residual variable in financing decisions. Profits reduced debt and investment increased debt. Exactly the equation I'm about to use. So I happily have gross investment being a linear function of the gap between a profit rate where capitalists invest nothing or invest exactly profits. It really doesn't matter which you choose. And then when there's profits greater than that, they invest more, and that's given by a simple slope parameter. Now, when you then include debt, you've now got the rate of change of debt is gross investment minus profits. So profit is now net of both wages and interest payments on debt, and that's now your more generalized equation. The government gets in there in the next stage. So what you get out of this, and I'll do it with modifying a flow chart here. You add in private debt. I need to first of all break this link here that I've got between profit and investment, just lining up the two. So I'm going to divide profits, and gross profit as pi, capital pi, by K to define the rate of profit. and then bring out an investment function and add the rate of change of the debt as the difference between gross investment and profits. And then you deduct the interest that's being paid from the gross profits to get net profits, and that's when you get your full model, which is Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So that's the investment function I bring in, and to bring it in on the chart I showed a moment ago, it's these little elements over here. So I've got profit divided by capital. There's a rate of profit. Subtract that from the rate point at which capitalists do not invest, multiply by a slope. You've got gross investment as a share of GDP, multiplied by GDP, you've now got gross investment. Now that doesn't change the actual nature of the model. It's still a two-dimensional model. So you're still confined in what two-dimensional models can do in system state terms, but it's still cyclical, just steeper cycles. To bring in the integral block for debt, I now add this element, that the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And then because of that, you have interest payments to make. So add interest inside there as well. And what you get is a completely different model that I first discovered in August of 1992, when I built the model that's in my 1995 JPKE paper. The reason it took 3 years to get there is, oh well, he's a good bloke. We finally became friends, but Paul Davidson wouldn't publish it until he had a hole in the journal big enough that he couldn't not publish it. So it took 3 years to get published after being accepted instantly. Anyway, so I then put this together, and what you get is this remarkable pattern of rising and falling cycles, which is something that is not in Minsky's hypothesis itself. In other words, this is an emergent property of the system. And that's something which actually transcends what Minsky himself was able to do, which is to justify why capitalism could fall into a debt deflation. But neoclassicals, when they saw part of the characteristic, which I've jumped over too quickly there, but I'll come back to it later, diminishing and rising cycles are a prelude to a crisis in the model. And neoclassicals have thought diminishing cycles, hey, that's how well we're managing the monetary system. So they took credit for what they called the Great Moderation. And this is Ben Bernanke. I find it hard to pronounce his name. I was calling Ben Bernanke, but anyway, let's keep it going. So he took credit for it, saying that it was improved control of inflation has caused this welcome change to the economy. And so unfortunately, it wasn't all that welcome, because just like I have in the model, that there were diminishing cycles followed by rising cycles. That turns up in the data. I'll show in a moment that the rising level of private debt causes a falling wages share, also in the data. And of course, the whole thing is driven by a rising level of private debt to GDP. So to understand why does the model generate these characteristics, we've got to do a bit of a deep dive into the mathematics here. And why does rising debt cause a falling wages share? I did not expect that at all. It was a surprise. I had to work out why on earth it happened. And then why does it appear to head towards equilibrium? Because the cycles, when they're getting smaller, you are approaching an equilibrium of the system, but then it diverges. We'll put this model together. Those are the definitions. I'm using GR for the growth rate here, just to simplify things. Pi S for the profit share, so that's profit divided by GDP. So that's the growth rate. And then the growth rate can be factored down into investment as a fraction of GDP. That's the next causal variable there. That's your investment function. So it's all driven by the rate of profit. Okay? The rate of profit is the determining system, as Marx argued back in the 1800s. The rate of change of wages is dependent on the employment rate. Okay, but I've now got to work out what are the equilibria. So I've got three system states: the employment rate, the wages share of GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio. And it turns out that there are two realistic equilibria. One of them has negative debt, so you can forget about that. But there's what Griselli and Costa-Lehmann nicknamed the good equilibrium, where you have a constant and positive employment rate and wages share and debt ratio. That's the equilibrium you'd want to converge to. What they named the bad equilibrium has got zero employment, zero wages share, and an infinite debt ratio. Okay. And that's what you want to avoid. So here's your equations for the good equilibrium. Well, that's in general, but I now want to actually solve for those. Under what conditions is the rate of change of this side zero? Well, that's where the growth rate equals these two. The rate of change of wages equals the rate of increase of labour productivity. And this is your function for the debt ratio being constant as well. So the growth rate has to equal the change in output to labour ratios plus population. Change in wages has to equal the output to labour ratio, and the growth rate equals investment minus profit share divided by the debt ratio. Notice that's profit share, not wages share. So let's go through the equilibrium now. So that's your equilibrium. This is going to give you the equilibrium for the wages share, and that's pretty easy. That has to be equal to the rate of change of wages share. So that's my equilibrium for the employment rate. It's the rate of change of labour to output labour ratio divided by the reaction function for workers in terms of wage demands, plus the 0 point for wages in the system. So that's going to be, the equilibrium employment rate is going to be above the level given by this 0 here. Now, the growth rate for that's now getting the equilibrium from the employment equation. So I've now got the growth rate has to be equal to the investment rate divided by capital output ratio minus depreciation. And I can now work out an equilibrium investment share in the economy. So I get the investment share for equilibrium has to be the capital output ratio multiplied by the sum of these three other parameters. And I can work out the equilibrium profit share from this. And this is explaining why we got this strange behavior. Because even though the system state is wages share, the equilibrium component of the system ends up being the profit share. So there's the gross investment function. There's equating the two. I finally get the equilibrium profit share is, I'm not going to try to talk through all those terms there, but it's an equilibrium profit share, not an equilibrium wages share. And that was quite a surprise. Again, I didn't expect it, but looking back at Marx, he got it right. He actually made this guess with his verbal model at the time. To put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages, the dependent, not the independent variable. He got it right. Okay, so Marx was, I saw Marx being rubbish for bad mathematics recently. That's certainly true of the labour theory of value, but his insights were extremely strong. So whether the equilibrium is stable or not, the income share it's going to fluctuate around is going to be the profit share, not the wages share. So the profit share is going to bounce around in equilibrium. It's the wages share which is independent of that and therefore can be driven by the third factor in the system, which is the debt share. So a higher debt share comes at the expense of a lower workers' share. Even though in this model I've got the capitalist borrowing the money, workers are being completely passive on that front. I don't have any household borrowing and so on. So what it turns out telling you, and this is not a surprise for anybody who's lived through the last 50 years, the true enemies of workers are not capitalists but bankers. And that sort of changes the class dynamics of Marx, but as I said, this model is derived from Marx plus Minsky. So the workers are the ones who suffer from a high level of debt, private debt, not the capitalists until the system breaks down. Now, the debt equilibrium, as you can expect, is a fairly complicated one. It does turn up as there's a quadratic term that turns up in the debt dynamics itself, and the full good equilibrium of the system is this set of outputs here. Again, the debt one is ridiculously complicated for a relatively simple model. And when you do your stability analysis, you find this is a strange attractor. So it's got the dominant eigenvalues. The real part of the dominant eigenvalue of the system is positive. But from a distance, the dominant eigenvalue from a distance is a negative eigenvalue that attracts you towards that equilibrium. Then when you get close to the equilibrium, you get repelled away in a cyclical fashion. So this is the dynamics of the whole system. I had to go looking and see where the hell this came from. So at the time I was building this model while doing my PhD, I was also doing courses in pure mathematics at the University of New South Wales. And as it happens, a wonderful bloke there, who's now, I think he's finally retired, but he was head of school for a while. He said, oh, that's the Permot-Manivelle route to chaos. This actually turns up as part of the Lorentz equations. It's a particular solution of the Lorentz equations where you have a turbulent flow that becomes laminar flow and then becomes turbulent again on the other side. So it's called the intermittent route to chaos. So the actual route to the chaos is cyclical, and it appears you're heading towards the good equilibrium, but then given the dynamics of the system, you end up in the bad equilibrium. So the cycles get smaller for a while, and then when you get close, they get larger, and then you're pushed away by those dominant eigenvalues towards the bad equilibrium. So that's the basic dynamics there. And I remember when I first showed it to one of my econometrics lecturers, a lovely guy as it happens, not your typical econometrician, but Eric took one look at it and said, Steve, if you've identified something is actually in real capitalism, we're in deep, deep trouble. That was back in 92. So, 15 years later, he was proven right. So again, why does it comes down to the investment-driven nature of the system, which Marx understood. So investment's a function of the profit rate. And there's some level of profit at which capitalists invest precisely profits. So whenever they get back to that point, they invest exactly what they earn in profits. Now, the cycle of the system, they're going to invest above that level and below and less below. So that's the profit share. So once you get to the point where that profit share is restored, it doesn't matter to capitalists what the value of this is or that is. Okay. So in that case, the basic way to describe it informally is that you borrow money during a boom and you've got to replay it during a slump. So what happens, the debt level ratchets up over time, and as it does, each time you get a higher level of debt, at the same level of profit share, you're going to have a lower workers' share. So the workers are the ones who pay for a higher level of private debt, which I think is a very radical conclusion out of this model. If people understood it, we wouldn't allow banks to lend as much as they do. So a rising debt share causes a lower workers' share. And then that's why in this system, the main class conflict is with bankers, not with capitalists. So you've got an inherently cyclical system. It's inherently monetary, and with firms borrow to finance investment, you get rising level of private debt over time, and that can lead you to a point at which the accumulated debt can be so great at one point that the dampening effect of falling wages is counteracted by the rising effect of compound interest, and you'll end up in a crisis. Now, can you avoid that crisis? This is the sort of question which we should be asking as economists. Of course, neoclassicals don't do it. Well, you can't avoid cycles, but you can avoid terminal collapse. And this is the way that Minsky spoke about financial stability as well. It wasn't equilibrium, it was avoiding breakdown. So I add net government inside the system. Now to what do we get in that role? And I'm going to assume that G is countercyclical. So G as a fraction of GDP will rise as employment falls. And this is, if I start from the model here, and by the way, this is just quickly illustrating something I haven't spoken about so far. Minsky stroke Ravel uses the standard flowchart paradigm of system dynamics, but it adds in what we call godly tables to enable you to do financial dynamics very well. So any term here is defining a differential equation for the system state. So I don't have debt defined as an integral block here. I've got it defined here because this equation says the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And this is now the financial side of the economy as well. So it's extremely easy to build this sort of model in Ravel. So where do I add government spending? Well, this is where Koleski comes in, and the true grandfather of non-orthodox economics in that sense. And I know that everybody here knows who Koleski is, but I'll just give a bit more background if there's anybody who's never discovered him before. So he came across as an engineer, fascinated by economics, taking an engineering approach, which is what I advocate, of course. And then the more he read about economics, the more horrified he was. And there's a wonderful tale which is told in an article in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, I think, where he was having dinner in London with Joan Robinson and Kaldor, maybe in lunch, I think it was lunch. And he walked inside and said, "I've worked out what economics is. It's the science of confusing stocks with flows." We all know that from dealing with our neoclassically brethren. So he developed, he's trying to work out how do you bring government spending in. And he reasoned by using a set of tables where he had income and expenditure, and of course they're necessarily equal. And then what he did is, let's take taxation. He said, let's assume wages are spent on consumption, so those two cancel out. So what you get is gross profits is gross investment plus capitalist consumption. And then the question was, what causes what? And again, lovely clear engineering logic. Well, capitalists can decide to consume more and invest in a given period, but they can't decide to earn more. So investment and consumption determines profits, not the other way around. Now, when you then generalise to include exports and government spending, and this, by the way, contradicts MMT on international trade, which is one of the other things that's pissing me off right now. So he adds in net exports and government deficit there. And then he said there's savings by workers as well. What you find is gross profits is gross investment plus capitalist consumption plus net exports plus the government deficit minus workers' savings. And therefore, government deficits increase profits, which again is why it's so ridiculous to watch capitalists and neoclassicals complaining about high levels of government spending. It's actually a major source of their profits. So I can add G into my equation here. So I've now got G plus Y. So Y is effectively the private sector and G is the government's injection on top of that. And how do I define G? Well, the same approach as for wage setting. I'll have a ratio, little g, of big G to Y, make G a linear function of the employment rate, but with the opposite slope to the wages determination equation. So the wages determination equation has employment minus this zero. To do one for the government, I just reverse it, okay? So G minus lambda. And then you get a negative reaction. So rising unemployment, falling government spending, rising employment, falling government spending, and vice versa. Now, what you get out of this when you do it with linear equations is equilibrium. So all those points here are sustained, that you don't collapse into a debt deflation anymore. And this is the important point. Exactly the same parameters in this model that led to a debt deflation lead to an equilibrium with the government being involved. So you're instantly getting a different conclusion to neoclassicals. Rather than government being an imposition that makes capitalism work less well, government spending is an essence element of a modern capitalist economy that means we avoid the debt deflations that was such a common phenomenon in the 1800s and early 1900s. So I bring in a switch function. We're still working on this particular idea, but we do have a little Heaviside function here, so you can turn on or off different elements to the system, giving a value of 1 or 0. And when I do this, I get a cyclical. I'm just going to go through this. This is a bit out of order, this particular slide here, but the main thing I want to bring in now is government spending, where deficit spending is a negative function of the employment rate, avoids a debt deflation. Now, there's no ideology to read this point. I'm not saying I'm pro-government. Okay? It's just the result of including the model and having realistic assumptions for it. So your 2D model reproduces the Goodwin's growth cycle, the 3D brings in Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and the 4D effectively gives you modern monetary theory. So what you get out of this, if you're working from strictly true definitions with incredibly simplifying assumptions that can't be disputed empirically or logically, then what you're finding is these are inherent characteristics of a capitalist economy. This is where we should start from in modeling a capitalist economy. Forget about micro, or throw out neoclassical micro. Now, all those functions I showed had linear behavioral functions. Investment was a linear function of the profit rate, the wages was a and same for deficit and so on. And that still gave me unstable dynamics because of structural nonlinearity. So you've got total wages, which is the wage rate times the employment rate, which is a quasi-quadratic. The debt equation is a quasi-hyperbola when you look at it. But of course, linear functions are unrealistic. It assumes that workers accept wage cuts as easily as wage rises. Whereas Phillips if you read Phillips' original paper, and I highly recommend doing that, you'll find he has, first of all, he says the relationship is nonlinear. Okay? That's absolutely critical to his argument. Workers are reluctant to go take wage cuts, but when there's more wages to be made by high levels of employment, they'll demand high wages. So it's going to be highly nonlinear. He actually says highly nonlinear there. Then you might have the rate of change of the demand for labour. So it's the first differential of employment also has an impact. And he also talked about basically wage price spirals, but seeing those as being caused by international issues rather than domestic. So and also a linear investment function implies capitalists go around smashing up factories. Or maybe Donald Trump does that, but normal capitalists don't do that sort of thing. And all the rational expectation stuff is nonsense. euphoric expectations come in, you have to have a rising function to indicate that, not just a linear function. So, linear function implies the government never panics. Of course it does. So what's the impact of bringing nonlinear behavioral functions in this model as well? Does it make any qualitative difference? These are I've got a few embedded Ravel files inside there. So if I have just the employment wages system, I get a closed loop. If I have nonlinear, I still get a closed loop, just a bit more um, um, aggressive slope of the functions. So it's qualitatively similar, but just a less circular limit cycle is the main impact there. If I include debt, that's the linear system, that's the nonlinear. Again, similar characteristics, not a lot to be said. It is certainly advantageous to use nonlinear for realism, but it doesn't have a qualitative impact upon the model. Put the government in here, on the other hand, that's the linear version, so you reach equilibrium. Nonlinear, you get sustained cycles. And this is one reason I'm a skeptic about, what do you call them, the long waves, I've forgotten the actual Leontief. Was it Leon? It wasn't Leontief, was it? It's I've forgotten who came up with the long wave theory. But I get long waves out of a short-term
Kondratiev.
model. So Kondratiev
Kondratiev.
wages. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So there's nothing long-term in this model, but I get long-term waves. So again, this is something that Forrester spoke about. That short-term dynamics can give you long-term characteristics. So it's qualitatively different, and it's much more realistic to have that sort of result. So what you have in that case, of course, interacting linear functions are ultimately going to reach there's going to be no change in the magnitude at different levels of the input variables. But with nonlinear, you get an incredible range of potential structures. So you get cycles all the time, and this has relatively recently been explored by Grzelli and Costa-Lima. And there's an area of mathematics called persistence theory. And what it talks about is under what conditions will all species in a dynamic system survive? It's not reaching equilibrium that's survival of those systems. And they applied that logic to my work and said, you will only get the continued existence of all species, which in this case are wages, employment, and private debt ratio, if you have a government. If you take the government away, you're going to have a crisis. So you have two possible outcomes in the private sector only: a good equilibrium, which you want to get to; a bad, you don't want to end up there. That's the end of capitalism. But with the four sector model, and this is summarizing Grzelli and Costa-Lima, all the bad equilibria are either unstable or unachievable, even when you're in the same region where without the government you'd fall into the bad equilibrium. So government intervention successfully destabilizes an otherwise stable equilibrium point. And that's a strong argument now from a system dynamics point of view in favor of government spending. So this is again them elaborating. We guarantee the employment rate does not remain indefinitely trapped in arbitrary small values, whereas without government intervention, it's guaranteed to converge to zero and remain there forever. So austerity means the government cannot prevent the collapse into a debt deflation. And consequently, if you have a timid government, you're going to be in trouble. So they can verify the disastrous consequences of austerity. Again, this is from mathematical logic, not being, taking a left-wing position. It's just showing without the government, if you impose austerity on the government, you're more likely to end up in a crisis. So again, it turns over a huge amount of conventional thinking. Now that's the presentation. I want to do a quick bit of advertising here. Obviously, I'd love to have more people use Ravel. Ty will hopefully give a bit of a show of what you can do with Ravel at a later seminar. But we're currently releasing it through Patreon. It's $2 a month for the modeling only version, $10 for the full data analysis. So I want to talk about what Ravel adds that's quite unique, and that is the godly tables, first of all, which I haven't shown so far. I'll show them in a moment. And that's what a godly table looks like. And what it does is you do double entry bookkeeping, make sure that each row is properly defined. Therefore, the entire model of the financial system is properly defined. And then a Ravel is a graphical way of handling multidimensional data. So that's a 4-dimensional data set there, and I'm pulling out of it a one-dimensional output, which is the percentage of private non-financial sector debt as a percentage of GDP for the United States. And the idea this is a replacement for pivot tables, which people always forget how to drive. This is a graphical, far more powerful way of handling multidimensional data. And one unique capability I'll mention here, which I know Mike was quite impressed when he first saw it, we generate all our equations in LaTeX. So if you want to export your equations or document them, it's automatic in Ravel. We just simply create the equations in LaTeX, and then it's easy to export them out, use them for formatting and documenting a model, or as Ty has done, put them into another program for doing data fitting and so on. And the main advantage of the godly tables is that it can show the structure of the financial system and make it possible to rapidly modify it far more quickly than you could do if you use the flowchart paradigm to build your financial sector models. So this is just a quick illustration of that. This is what the neoclassicals think is the real world. This is where you have the government borrowing from households, the loanable funds model. And you've run the model with even a 1% of GDP deficit, you get an absolute blowout in the government debt to GDP ratio. Interest payments become absolutely impossible. This is the crisis that all the mainstream mob think we're inevitably going to face. But of course, it's a myth. The government does not sell initially to the households, it sells to banks. So the debt of the government is actually given to the banks in the first instance, not to the households. So now, just by modifying this, I've now got the bonds, the debts now changed from households to the banks, and then the government mainly banks at the central bank. So into the government's operations here, and then you find to complete this, you've now got to show that bonds are paid for using reserves, which is the financial transaction that the central bank runs at all the auctions. The deficit comes from increases reserves, and so do interest payments. And then there's a little glitch here. The program should have automatically updated over here, but it didn't. So I've got to now type in the interest on bonds as an input there, which took me a while to work that out. So I now type interest here, and interest is paid to the banks. And to make, the banks had no role in the previous model. So I've got a little logic switch down here called bombed, and I flip that switch, and now look what happens. You've got a rising money supply, rising level of GDP, and your debt ratio stabilizes. Okay? So this is I'm trying to get this through to politicians. There's a lot of left-wing politicians in the UK which are now amenable to this argument. So the debt crisis is a furphy, as Australians call it. It's a hypothetical myth of neoclassical economics. It doesn't happen, and it won't happen in the real world. And if we can get rid of that nonsense, then we might actually have a better managed capitalist economy. So that's the Ravel, the godly table side of things. Ravel, I haven't done an animation here, but it's a graphical way of analyzing multidimensional data. And I think it's a lot more powerful than pivot tables. And as time goes on, if we get more investment funds, we'll integrate the data side with the system dynamic side much more so than we've done so far. So that's the presentation. If you want to catch up with my work in general, I have a Patreon page, a Substack page, and I'm now giving an online course. I've got about 700 students have signed up for that. Pardon the marketing, okay? I've got a cookie cutter approach with a marketing firm. It annoys the hell out of me too, but it gets people into my course, and the course is real and going very well. And we're on the course on a platform called School now. And then Ravel itself, so I've said you can get it from that location for Revelation. That's it. Let's have a conversation. Ugh. Hope it wasn't too fast. Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Steve,
Professor.
very much. So I have one question. Let me lead things off, and then we'll see where we go. As we all know, I think during the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes wrote his famous book, right, to think differently about why we were in this great slump, and more importantly, why we weren't getting out of it. We seem to be stuck, right? And the dominant paradigm of the day, the classical economist, Say's law is true and all that stuff, was just empirically wrong, right? And so he thought hard about, well, why are we here and what do we do to get out? And of course, World War II kind of got in the way of things. But after World War II, we had quote unquote the Keynesian revolution, and at least in macro, well, it created macroeconomics, but we thought about things differently. So more recently, we had not the Great Depression, but the Great Recession, right?
Mhm.
And no other than, I think it was Queen Elizabeth at the time, asked, well, why couldn't you economists predict this? Now we have, Keynes didn't have macroeconomics, but we do today. My point is, when you have a system that's kind of locked into a paradigm, it's sort of a path dependent process, or normal science, as Thomas Kuhn would say. It kind of takes a revolution, some big thing to knock the, knock the system out of its ingrained pattern. It happened during the Great Depression. It did not really happen during the Great Recession. I mean, there was some people started to say, hey, we should, in the profession, should maybe look at things differently. Today we have Ravel, we have Steve Keen in his books, we have system dynamics. Steve, why do you think we didn't have, or haven't yet had, a kind of Keynesian revolution in modern times?
Well, two parts to that question. First of all, we had a Keynesian revolution that lasted about 6 weeks in the 1930s, because Keynes published the general theory. He then published a short paper called The General Theory of Employment. That's the total title, about 15 pages long, which was his summary of the general theory. But Hicks wrote his book review. Okay, and in the book's review, if you look at Hicks's own history, no, Hicks couldn't make hide nor hair of Keynes. Most neoclassicals couldn't understand him either, because he's talking with a different paradigm, though they weren't aware of it. Maybe even Keynes wasn't aware of that. But within a short while, Hicks dragged out a model he actually wrote in 1933, which was a Walrasian equilibrium model with three markets to it, where you could forget about the third market when you're in Walrasian equilibrium. And then that's intersecting supply and demand curves became intersecting ISLM curves, and then that took over. And so the Keynesian revolution was cut off by Hicks within literally a matter of weeks after it had begun. And if you look at why people accepted Keynes back then, whether we were not understanding him and choosing the wrong interpretation, I actually relate it to the dynamics of the system in the 1930s. So unemployment went from recorded rate of 0%. There weren't no workers unemployed, but the number, rounding error, was 0.0% unemployment in 1929. By 1932, it hit 25% of the population. Now, that was just total shock for the neoclassicals of the day, total shock for the governments. And then you had the New Deal and all the spending by the government to try to reverse what was happening in the private sector. Also, all the bank shutdowns and huge reforms there under the Pecora Commission. Unemployment then fell down to 11% by 1935-36. Now, at this stage, the neoclassicals, of course, they're all neoclassicals, advising, I forget, was it Roosevelt? I forget my president's.
FDR, yeah, Roosevelt.
Okay. Advising Roosevelt, well, you better get the budget back in balance again, which he headed towards doing in 1936-37, and unemployment rose from 11% to 20% again. Now, I think at that point, neoclassicals went, we don't know what the fuck is going on. Can anybody else tell us? Keynes's book arrives. Hallelujah, we're going to believe you. We don't understand you. Hicks explains this to us. Oh, it's that supply and demand curves with a bent curve for the money market. Oh, thank God, we can understand this stuff. And that's what became the so-called Keynesian revolution. Now, all the people in this crowd here have been fighting against that all their lives as a bastard. It was because John Robinson called bastard Keynesian. Now, we didn't even get to that point this time round. Okay, and that's some ways because big government, which is one of the factors that Minsky said would stabilize the system, and he was right, meant that we didn't go down to the level of unemployment we could have hit if we had the level of government spending that applied back in 1929. Level of government debt was reduced from 30% of GDP to 15% in the 1920s by Coolidge. And government spending, there was no unemployment benefits. Their taxation was relatively trivial. You didn't have the stabilizing effect of those interventions on the economy. After World War II, government spending went from about 3% of GDP, that's pretty much the average for the whole of the 19th century, to 20 or 30%, and then the government's countervailing forces are much stronger. But you've basically asked a question of why did an intellectual revolution not occur? And I think the reason is that when you look at Kuhn, of course, Kuhn says scientific revolutions are opposed by people in the dominant paradigm. You never convert those in the dominant paradigm. They'll stick with it till they die. And it says when they do die, they're replaced by young students who understand the need for a new paradigm or know of one, like Planck's own work. We're bringing in quantum mechanics. And so when the professors have to replace themselves, they replace themselves with young students who are devotees of the new paradigm. And then, to summarize Kuhn, he didn't actually, summarize Max Planck rather, he didn't actually say science advances one funeral at a time, but that's a reasonable summary. Unfortunately, neoclassical economics doesn't do the same thing because given the ideological appeal that the neoclassical model has, there will still be some students in the classroom who, despite the fact the model's completely failed, despite the fact that its predictions about what was possible were totally wrong, they're still seduced by the idea of an equilibrium system that means you can work without power and everybody gets paid what they deserve, etc., etc. So they're the idiots, the useful idiots that the professors replace themselves with, and you don't get generational change. So I think that's the main reason. You look around us, I mean, in our circle here, we're all obviously critics of the mainstream and happy to talk about an alternative paradigm. But we're split-offs. We didn't accept the neoclassical synthesis of Samuelson and Hicks. We broke away. So what happens in economics is not a revolution, but fragmentation. And frankly, I hate to say it, but I think neoclassical economics is going to outlast capitalism.
So let me follow up real quickly, Steve. So might it be that the conclusion of what you've just said is that folks like us need to kind of sidestep or avoid the economics profession and go to concerned citizens, perhaps the business community, the media, politicians, and what have you, and just not try to, sort of pry people out of the old paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, Planck himself said he could never do it. It's actually, I do recommend reading his scientific autobiography. And he states in that, he said, it has been one of the greatest disappointments of my life that I have seldom, he says, I should say, in fact, never, persuaded somebody of a new approach with a mathematical proof. They simply, so it's a human characteristic, not once you've wedded to a paradigm, to try to maintain the paradigm, even in the face of outrageous anomalies like the Great Depression was. So it doesn't happen in sciences either, but you can rely upon generational change. And one of the reasons, again, is that crises like the Great Depression, you can't reproduce it. The Michelson-Morley experiment, you can reproduce it. So the anomalies never go away in physics, whereas they get forgotten in economics. So that's one reason I'm trying to use the Godley table side of Ravel to make the point to political parties in the UK. There were three, not so much new, but one revived, the Greens, with a new leader who's quite aware about government money creation capabilities, which was what Ravel can illustrate. George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn's parties. And I've been in touch with all three. And there's some possibility to get them to realise government spending is not constrained by government debt. So then I can say, look, you can argue against your political rivals. Your political rivals say, how can we pay for it? And they're slashing national health as a result. You can say, we pay for it by creating the money. We want to hire the workers and train the doctors and nurses and so on. You can do it. Now, that will be potentially a positive case to get out of it. But I still think the neoclassical paradigm is so deeply embedded in people's minds that it'll be there until capitalism collapses. And I'm giving that about 20 years, by the way, if we're lucky.
Incorrect mental models, very
Yeah,
dominant.
just getting rid of them. They're a disease. And this, like one thing I've done as well, I don't cover it here, obviously, but I did in my new book for Elon Musk, is I worked out taking what we know the empirical cost structure of firms are, the downward sloping, rectangular hyperbola of average fixed cost and constant or falling variable cost, not the crazy rising stuff from neoclassicals. I've worked out the alternative profit equation. And that profit equation is basically rate of change of profit is price minus variable cost. Okay? So we can use that sort of thing to attack what the neoclassicals have done, but it's You know, the disease of supply and demand curves. It's such a seductive little meme, and I'm trying to destroy it by saying it doesn't even describe an actual market. So we've got to attack them on all fronts. And that's one reason I wrote Debunking Economics. I just want you to, I wish I made it tougher. It's just ludicrous how deeply ingrained this neoclassical way of thinking is, not just amongst academic economists, but the general public, journalists, and politicians.
Right. Okay. So, would anyone else like to ask Steve some questions here? We have him for a little bit yet. Please unmute yourself and hop right in. Otherwise, I have more, but I don't want to dominate things here.
Come
I'm not
on, come
seeing
on,
anybody
chickens, have a
hopping.
go.
So let me throw another one at you, Steve, and then maybe
Thanks, mate.
somebody will. So talk a little bit about how traditionally in economics we don't put energy into our production
Yeah,
functions,
yeah,
whether
thank
they're
you. Okay, that's,
Leontief or Cobb Douglas or SMAC or whatever, and what
yeah,
might be the implications of that.
yeah. Well, one thing I mean, I've been working on the energy issue for a long time, or wanting to work on it, and working with Bob Ayres, who's the physicist who did the most work to try to bring energy into into economic production functions. Everything I saw used a Cobb Douglas at some point. So Bob developed what he called the Linux um, equation, uh, which still had a Cobb Douglas production function as part of it in index numbers, not in actual total amounts. And I thought that this it has two weird implications to it. One is that that you can produce without energy, because the coefficients for energy in the standard way, Cobb Douglas extended by making a third factor and having a third power for that, reflecting energy's percentage of GDP, which is about 5%. So it basically told you a double energy input and you'll increase output by 5%, which is, crazy. And it also implied energy was a separate input to labor and capital. So you could put workers and machines inside a factory and then hit it with a lightning bolt and goods would come out the other side. I thought there's something wrong with that. So walking through Bob's house one day, uh, I just had this thought pop into my head, because his house was full of statues. Labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. What that meant in mathematical terms was that rather than energy being a third independent factor, it's an input to labor and capital without which they can do no work. 10 minutes later, I scribbled it out in Cobb Douglas terms, and it turned out that what you had really was making output was energy. So you place K, with K for the number of machines still, times EK, which is the energy consumed by a machine per year, times little ek, which is the percentage of that energy that's turned into useful work. And I did the same thing with the Cobb Douglas production function. And what it turned out is the capital to output ratio ended up being the inverse of that efficiency term. So capital output ratio is greater than 3 for most countries, because the the conversion of energy into useful work, which is limited by the laws of thermodynamics, must be less than half. And what you get is energy. Fundamentally, it tells you that GDP is energy turned into useful work. So that was my first innovation. And as a result, the neoclassical can't cope with it. You destroy their theory if you include energy properly, because the whole marginal productivity thing falls over. But post-Keynesian, it's just saying, oh, rather than calling it mu, let's call it EK. And rather than dividing it by it, let's multiply by it. That's all you have to do with post-Keynesian models to turn it from an empirical regularity that you had to sort of justify to your friends while you used it, to something actually based on the laws of thermodynamics. So that's a major transformation there. Then one thing which I was quite amazed by when I first did the numbers, and this is a common experience for me, when I first did the stuff on debt and explained it to my students back in the 90s, and then the financial crisis happened in 2007, and the severity of the fall in credit was absolutely huge. And I told my students, if I was trying to fool you, I wouldn't dare make up numbers that are as extreme as the actual data. Now, when I then looked at the same thing for energy, you can find countries with rising energy and falling GDP and vice versa in the data set. But when you look at the global, what they call gross world product, GWP, and you look at global energy consumption, the correlation of the two is about 0.992, which again, they're both rising, so you'd expect a high correlation. But the correlation of the change in gross world product to the change in global energy consumption is 0.88 with annual data. It is just ludicrously high. So what it tells you at a fundamental level, what GDP actually is energy converted into useful work. And that happens in everything. The fact that we've all got lights shining on ourselves now is energy turned into useful work. If you used an elevator to get to your flat, which I did today, that's energy turned into useful work. So it makes energy the absolute focus of economic theory, and that's what it should be.
So let me follow up. I met and had a nice conversation with Bob Ayers. I believe it was like 1989. I was very young pup, and
Yep.
We talked about dynamic modeling, and I believe he worked in discrete time, and the our colleagues in post Keynesian economics, the stock flow consistent modelers, also tend to work in discrete time, and they're sort of our colleagues, sort of
Yeah.
playing in the same sandbox, but they work in discrete time. What do you think about that, Steve? Working in discrete time in economics versus continuous time, as we do primarily in system dynamics.
It's nonsense, and it's dangerous nonsense because it stops them actually looking at underlying factors. I think Giuseppe Fontana is one of the very good post-Keynesians. He's a professor at Leeds. He actually pointed out, I can't find the bloody paper. It's one of those things that slipped through my grasp. But he made a point that you had to assume everything was same during a period. So all the interesting stuff happened between periods. Okay, so you couldn't even see what's going on in terms of the dynamics of credit, for example. But because I work like you do in continuous time, when I framed the role of credit in aggregate demand and income, credit was credit was part of the change function of GDP. So you can get logical insights out of continuous time you can't get out of discrete time. And of course, as Forrest wrote right back in '56, the excuse that the post-Keynesians who use that will use, and Mark Lavoie has said this to me, the data is discrete, so we should use discrete modeling. And what they do is they use t and t minus 1, where 1 is always a year. So your consumption this year is based on last year's income. Tell me about it. Mine's based on last week's income. It's just nonsense how much it distorts the real world. They always use 1. They never use any other bloody time period. So they end up doing bad amateur jobs with discrete time. And when I tell them, look, you should use continuous time. Oh, but how do you choose the time step? And I say, mathematicians did that for you 100 years ago with the Runge-Kutta algorithm, or whatever it was, 80 years ago. So there's a huge labor that they put on themselves that they think they're saving themselves. And I really don't know how to get around it. So one thing in designing Ravel, I deliberately excluded discrete time capabilities. Okay. Could have added them. I've got a good enough program to get that done. Bullshit. That's like giving children matches. So it's deadly, and we're going to get rid of it. And probably the main thing we can do to benefit our side of economics is to get post-Keynesians to stop using discrete time and start using continuous time.
So let me, thanks for that, Steve. So let me open it up. Does anybody else have a question or a comment based on what you're hearing? Please, we got a little bit of time yet here. Please unmute and jump in.
Got one from JM here in the chat, and that's asking, why does interpretation of recent inflationary episodes, if you use government debt as non-threatening, when you take a look, for start, when you look at how much money is created by the government, and MMT is not good on this. So they haven't built anything like Ravel, and I'm trying to get them to use it. And there's a lot of shitty behavior inside MMT circles, which means people aren't using it when they should, which really pisses me off. But they basically talk about government money creation all the way through. But of course, the private sector does as well. And government money creation can be cancelled by bonds, the private banks selling government bonds on the secondary market. And to sell those bonds, deposits go down, and so do the ownerships of bonds at the banks. So that destroys government money creation. Now, Richard Vague, who's a name that you may not have heard of, but I highly recommend looking up Richard's research. Richard is a billionaire who used to run 2 banks and is now a critic of private debt. and has a great research group called Dead Economics, and he has a website called Tycho, Tycho, after the old astronomer who did all the observations and of astronomy that led to the Copernican revolution. He has looked at government money creation over the period from 1980 to 2024. And between 2020 and 2024, the level of the money supply, which is created by the government sector, was less than 10% of the increase in the money supply. And then in the period 1980 to 2000, government money creation was actually negative. So it's rather hard to blame inflation on government money creation when it was negative for the 20 years between 1980 and 2000. And when you again do a very similar disaggregation as I've done with this model in terms of taking GDP and then breaking it down to price times output and so on, you find, and this is again work of Koleski, you can find this in his theory of economic dynamics, the three factors that cause inflation are changes in markups, changes in money wages, and changes in productivity per worker. And so this is the work that is being continued on these days by Isabella Weber and also by Blair Fix. It basically says if you want to control inflation, you've got to have wage and profit negotiations to get workers and capitalists to agree not to get involved in a competitive wage price spiral. And the other factor, of course, is improving labour productivity and also reducing energy costs. Now, energy costs are going up no matter what. We're going to have rising inflation from rising energy costs as we go forward. And the main reason we have inflation is not that the printing of creating of money causes inflation. There was obviously huge government money creation during COVID, but it then means the level of aggregate of demand being felt by producers is so high, they feel they can put their markups without challenging their market share. So it isn't, money doesn't cause inflation. Workers and capitalists and technological change cause inflation. I covered the details of that by the book that I mentioned. I might bring it up on screen, the one I've just written for Elon Musk, supposedly, which covers that in a fair bit of detail.
Thank you.
So here's a chat question, Steve, while you're doing that. Do you think there is, where'd it go? Here, hang on. Do you think there are neoclassical roots still ingrained in behavioral economics that is making a field like behavioral macro yet to be found? Since we are trying to assess an individual level, but we can't integrate the behavioral effects for the mass. Also, do you think if we could have behavioral macro to take collective human behavior under consideration, we could have intervened in the 2008 crisis? So what do you think about a behavioral macroeconomics instead of a behavioral micro, I guess is what
I'm not particularly fussed about it. I mean, having sat through quite a few seminars where behavioral economists were presenting their gear next to a couple of neoclassicals, you get this deviation and that deviation from what neoclassicals define as rational. And the attitude of the neoclassicals is, oh, this deviation, that deviation, let's just assume rationality. So in a perverse sort of way, behavioral economics reinforces neoclassical by saying it's too hard to take care of all these deviations from rationality. Let's just assume rationality. That's one reason they can coexist with behavioral research, is because they don't challenge the underlying research paradigm. So I think it's much more so. My attack is system dynamics. Get people to realize what a system dynamics approach can do. And that's why, I've developed this argument that I've shown today, that you can derive post-Keynesian economics from strictly true macroeconomic definitions. And that to me is a better attack than saying do behavioral, because behavioral doesn't challenge them. They'll just go back and say, oh, too complicated, let's just assume rationality. You assume rationality here and you get Minsky and Koleski. You don't get the neoclassical fantasy of equilibrium.
Now, I would throw in one area where I think there might be a place for a behavioral macro, and this is just sort of in real time here, but I think might be in the area of expectation formation, because many, if not most, macro models have some aspect of expectations of the future, right? Because we're facing uncertainty in our decisions. Should I invest or not? Blah, blah, blah. And, rational expectations are kind of suspect, let's say. Adaptive expectations, as you mentioned earlier, when in discrete time, you just make it one. It's, I expect this term period, what happened last period. But if you start getting into, well, what do people really do when they make their sort of forecasts of the future, form their expectations? They anchor and adjust, and they do various things like that. That might be an area where in a macro model that you could have some interesting stuff. But that's what leaped to mind, Steve.
Yeah, well, I think on expectations, we need to throw rational expectations is irrational. You should go back and read Muth's 1961 paper. And the way it was actually brought in to try to destroy the cobweb model, the main, you had the hog cycle. And he didn't like the fact that it was a dynamic model that gave that. He thought it had to be based on neoclassical thought. And so he brings in the idea that the expectations are predictions of the relevant theory, okay? Which is why you get what they call model consistent behavior and so on. But if you take a look at how he justified it, there's an absolutely hilarious phrase at one point where he says, he's justifying it, says, information is scarce and. Now, if you say something is scarce and, what's the next word from a neoclassical point of view? Has a price, doesn't it? Okay. So therefore, you're only going to buy as much of it as is going to maximize your utility. So if you have information and it's scarce and it has a price, you use information until such point as the marginal utility of the information equals the marginal cost. So you'll be working with imperfect information. Now, he didn't say that. What he said was information is scarce and the economic system generally does not waste it. In other words, there's an assumption in neoclassical theory that information is free. And that's garbage. That contradicts neoclassical theory. And this is what I find they do all the time. It's something I've done, they're looking for general principles behind all the critiques I've made over time. And the thing is, because it's a illogical foundation, the whole idea of being able to take subjective expectations of a single individual and then think it can scale it to a macroeconomy, all sorts of crazy stuff results from that, because that's what it's called the Sonnenschein-Mann-Schulter-Brer theorem. They assume we're all the same, and they assume all commodities are the same. Or they assume there's a benevolent dictator that redistributes income. You can find that in Maskell. So they end up with a crazy assumption that contradicts their underlying foundations. With rational expectations, what they're assuming is information is complete and free, and that is non-neoclassical.
Okay. Thank you for that, Steve. All right. So I'm looking at the clock here. I think we got about 15 minutes left.